Hello and welcome to the Education Connections webinar from No Child Left Behind to Next Generation College and Career Ready State Standards, supporting English language learners in an era of standards with Dr. Wayne Wright. My name is Sarah Moore and I am the Project Director of Education Connections, an initiative of the Center for Applied Linguistics in collaboration with the University of Oregon. Today we will meet for 1 hour and end promptly at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We are pleased to be joined by Dr. Wayne Wright, Professor, and Barbara I. Cook, Chair of Literacy and Language in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at Purdue University. Dr. Wright's research focuses on language and educational policies, programs, and practices for language minority students. He has many years of experience teaching in bilingual and English as a second language classrooms with students from kindergartners to adults. He has authored publications on a range of topics relating to the education of language minority students, including Foundations for Teaching English Language Learners, Theory, Research, Policy, and Practice, and Handbook of Bilingual and Multilingual Education. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from California State University, Long Beach, and his doctorate in educational leadership and policy studies from Arizona State University. We are delighted to have Dr. Wright with us today. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Wright.
Thank you.
We'll begin today's session with a brief introduction and overview of Education Connections. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Wright following his presentation. We'll have some time reserved for questions and comments from participants. We'll be monitoring questions as they come in, and we encourage you to send along any thoughts or questions that come to mind during the presentation using the questions box in the GoToWebinar window. During today's session, we'll also be posting some polling questions related to your background in today's topic. Once results are in, we'll post them for you to view. At the end of the Q&A, we'll wrap up by briefly highlighting the Education Connections monthly lesson planning competition, which is currently underway for the month of April and May. We also invite you to join Education Connections via the link on your screen to access additional resources on standards-based instruction for English learners and to enter this month's lesson planning competition, in which winners receive a $100 prize. For those of you who may be new to Education Connections, we wanted to briefly introduce you to the community and resources available. Education Connections is a free online community that provides access to a wide range of resources and brings educators together to collaborate around implementing high-quality, standards-based instruction with all students and especially English learner students. It is an initiative of the Center for Applied Linguistics and is hosted on the University of Oregon's OBAverse platform. Education Connections provides professional learning communities, resources, webinars, and lesson planning tools, as well as a monthly lesson planning competition. Through the PLCs, you can share best practices with peers around the country. You can also access a range of teacher-oriented resources, including archives of all of our webinars and lesson planning tools, as well as lesson plans prepared by other educators and a lesson plan template. And of course, you can submit a lesson plan to win $100 in our monthly competition. We also have weekly features in our forums, Tuesdays Tips and Fun Fact Fridays, providing tips and news to keep you informed regularly with concrete turn and takes for your classroom. Anyone is welcome to join, so we invite you to sign up today if you're not already a member. In connection with today's webinar, the publisher of Dr. Wright's book is offering discounts on 14 different books related to the education of English learners and emergent bilingual students. These include Dr. Wright's book, Foundations for Teaching English Language Learners, a core text used by teachers and teachers in training to learn about effective instruction for English learners, as well as a new book, Common Core Bilingual and English Language Learners. Dr. Wright has a chapter in this edited volume that expands upon the content he'll present in today's session. If you'd like to take advantage of this offer, simply go to the website listed on your screen. We'll also post a link in the chat box within GoToWebinar. The link will also be available on Education Connections under Webinars. As a reminder, the Education Connections team will be posting a video archive of the webinar, a PDF of the PowerPoint. And links to resources related to today's webinar. To access these resources, log on to Education Connections and click on the Webinars tab. we'll now launch a few polls. And the first has to do with the grade levels with which you primarily work. Are these students in the elementary, middle, high school, post-secondary settings, or something that's not necessarily related to these particular options? And we have results coming in, lots of post-secondary, lots of NA, and a nice representation of elementary. Okay, well, now that we have most of our respondents' findings, we have 20% elementary, 23% post-secondary, 7% middle, and 10% high school, with about 40% choosing not applicable. So a nice range there. Great. Glad to have everyone from these diverse backgrounds. And here we're asking, what is your current position? Are you a general content education teacher? Are you an ELL or ESOL teacher, a bilingual teacher, an administrator, or other? And again, it looks like we have some nice representation other than those who are selecting our other category. Lots of ESL and ESOL teachers, 26%. 21% administrator, a couple of content general education teachers at 3% and 3% bilingual, and then we have 47% others. So always nice to have our bilingual educators with us. Fantastic. And then as a nice introduction to today's discussion, do you have faith in standardized tests as a valid and reliable measure of what students can do? Okay, and we have lots of responses coming in. Good, nice representation. It looks like about a quarter of us said, or more like a fifth, 21% says yes, 53% say no, and 26% I'm not sure. So yeah, all of those absolutely absolutely reasonable. So I think what we'll do now is turn it over to Dr. Wright. And thank you again for joining us today.
Okay, greetings everyone, and thank you so much for taking time this afternoon to participate. I'm very grateful to the Center for Applied Linguistics for making this possible. And I appreciate you asking those questions because that really helps me to kind of put everything into context. So as mentioned, we'll be focusing on moving from No Child Left Behind to the next generation college and career readiness standards and how we can support ELLs in this era of standards. And so first we're going to look at what has No Child Left Behind accomplished for English language learners. We've had the law with us now for a long time, and we do have some data that we can look at. And then as we're moving into the Common Core state standards, what are the challenges and opportunities for ELLs under this new initiative? And then finally, what are the implications for effective instruction for ELLs? Okay, first to kind of put everything into context, this is a political cartoon that actually was under Bush Sr., but it really represents to me what federal education policy has been like. And basically they found that the educational achievement of students hasn't been that great, so then federal policies is simply mandate that they do better. And so that kind of is represented by this political cartoon. Also, you've probably noticed that our obsession with high-stakes testing has become so ingrained within our society. It's even showing in places like the comics page. And so here's a comic strip from One Big Happy where the kids are talking to their playground lady, and they ask her, what do we got to take somebody test? And she gives the standard school district answer, testing is a way for educators and others to measure the students' progress. And the kids are like, what's that mean? And one of them says, it means they do it to figure out how dumb we are. And the kid responds, hey, I don't need no test to prove that. But what's interesting about this, if you think about most standardized tests, they're typically given at the end of the school year. The results come back either right before the kids leave or after they've left. And so how useful are those results really in driving instruction? Plus, do they really give teachers information that they didn't already know from working with the students all year? Okay, and our obsession with testing is represented in this cartoon strip where the teacher explains they have to get down the slide in 2.7 seconds or we lose our funding. In school soon, the recess aptitude test. Okay, so we've kind of gotten to this mindset that unless we can measure it, it's not valuable or worth doing in schools. And I think that's something we also need to move away from and start understanding that there are lots of things that happen in school that really can't be measured, that are equally important, if not more important and valuable. Okay, and this is a real-life example. When I was in Arizona, this was a public school, an elementary school, and what you see is you see two students sitting in a classroom that's been set up as a test prep center, and behind them that is actually a bulletin board where teachers probably spent countless hours die-cutting each of those numbers, gluing them and pasting them up on the wall. And what that represents is it shows the test scores for the different grade levels, and on the left side of each column you have this particular school, and on the right side you have the highest scoring school in that district. And what's important to understand about these scores is that these are from a norm reference test, the SAT-9, and that is a norm reference test, so it's not a matter of are the students getting all the answers correct, but it's how does their performance compare to the other students within the norming population. So this particular school is a school that's about 90% Hispanic, about 85% English language learners, and 100% free and reduced lunch. And they're being compared to a school in another part of the district where it's a much higher SES status, very few English language learners, etc. And so someone must have thought that this would motivate the students, motivate the teachers to come in and just see this glaring example in their face every day about how inadequate they are compared to these other schools. And to me it also represents a gross misunderstanding of how high-stakes testing works, particularly norm reference testing in particular. And to me this represents also just that there's a lot of misinformation out there about what high-stakes tests are, what they can do, and what their limitations are. And hopefully we'll have a chance to explore some of that today. So rewinding a little bit, let's talk about No Child Left Behind. And remember that it promised to close achievement gaps so that no child will be left behind. And there was this requirement that 100% of the students will pass state tests in reading, language arts, and math by 2014. Okay? So obviously that was last year, and if you haven't checked, that didn't happen. Okay? But let's look at the policy and what it was trying to do. And so to get to that magical goal of 100% passing rate by 2014, states were required to set annual measurable achievement objectives, or AMAOs, to see if states were making adequate yearly progress in attaining this goal. So every year they'd have a goal, and every year that goal would get higher until the 2014 of 100% passing. And then in addition to that, we had to track the progress of each subgroup, including a group called LEP, Limited English Proficient, which unfortunately is what English language learners were called under the federal law. Okay, so let's acknowledge some positive aspects of No Child Left Behind. First, we do know that rigorous academic standards can address the problem of low student expectations, and they can provide a clear expectation of what students need to learn. And we could arguably say that they brought renewed attention to the needs of English language learners. So some advocates like to say we're no more invisible kids because the schools can no longer afford to neglect their English language learner students. However, in this presentation, I will show you there were some ways that states still found to basically hide or make ELLs invisible even within the system itself. Okay, so No Child Left Behind mandates that English language learners be tested in a valid and reliable manner through testing accommodations. Okay, so they knew making this policy that it's going to be challenging for English language learners because they lack proficiency in the language at the test. So how do we address that? Well, then we simply require the states to provide accommodations, and then everything will be fine, right? Well, let's look at this more closely. There's an office within the federal government called the Government Accountability Office, and they're basically a watchdog for other federal agencies. When they're doing something wrong, they'll go and investigate and issue a report. So they did an investigation. They issued a report chastising the U.S. Department of Education because they found that they were failing to help states figure out how to measure the progress of English language learners. In other words, the Department of Ed, through No Child Left Behind, said, test ELLs in a valid, reliable manner. The state said, we don't know how to do that, please help us. And then the Department of Ed said, well, we really don't know either. So they got in trouble for that. So the Department of Ed went out and they got a bunch of testing experts, and they said, please review the literature on high-stakes testing for English language learners and how to provide accommodations. And then they released this report called Practical Guidelines for the Education of English Language Learners, research-based recommendations for the use of accommodations in large-scale assessments. Okay, that came out in 2006. Extensive review of the research. Okay, sounds great, right? Need help? Go to the Department of Ed website, download this document, and you'll get the help you need. Well, looking at this report at the end on page 29, this was the grand conclusion of this review of the research. The authors wrote, and I quote, "None of the accommodations examined has leveled the playing field for English language learners. Many accommodations currently in use across the country do not directly or indirectly address the linguistic needs of English language learners. At the same time, many of the linguistically appropriate accommodations that have been studied empirically were found in this review to have little or no impact on the test performance of English language learners." Okay, so that was your grand guidance document from the Department of Ed. In other words, No Child Behind mandates that we test ELLs in a valid, reliable manner, yet we do not know how to test ELLs in a valid and reliable manner. Okay, moving on, let's look specifically at Title III of No Child Left Behind. Okay, this is the part that requires each state to create English language proficiency standards and then tests or assessments to measure those standards. And then based on those, there are 3 annual measurable achievement objectives that are specific to Title III, wherein school districts and states are held accountable. So the first AMAO, number 1, is make progress in learning English. So in other words, schools and districts were responsible to make sure that an increasing percentage of ELLs move up at least one proficiency level as determined by their state's ELP test. So we had to have a certain number of level 1s, move to level 2 to level 3, level 3 to level 4, etc. Okay, we want to see an increasing percentage of that movement every year. Okay, under AMAO number 2, attaining English proficiency, schools and districts were required to show an increasing percentage of ELLs reaching that proficiency level as defined by their state ELP tests and other criteria within the state. Okay, and then under AMAO number 3 was basically tied in with Title I. So ELLs had to take the same math and reading tests as all the other students, and this was based on whether they're making whatever growth target or passing target was for that year under the AMAO for the AYP. So you can see that making progress under Title III also requires having an increasing number of ELLs pass the regular state tests in math and English. Okay, so now the question is, how are ELLs doing under this system? So the Department of Education is required to provide a biannual report to Congress on Title III, which means they have to do this every 2 years. They have to report on the number of ELLs being served and the progress that each state is making in meeting those Title III and also the Title I objectives for ELLs. The most recent report came out in June of 2013, and it provides data for up to 2010, so roughly 10 years of No Child Left Behind. Okay, so let's take a look at the findings. So first finding is by No Child Left Behind's own criteria, states are failing miserably. Okay, 83% of the states have failed to make adequate yearly progress for their ELLs, or the LEP subgroup. And so the question then becomes, is this failure really due to bad teachers, bad schools, bad students? And if so, ironically, wasn't that what No Child Left Behind was supposed to fix, okay, and close those achievement gaps? So by its own definition, it failed in that regard. Or is this failure due to an ill-conceived accountability program with unreasonable expectations and deep flaws in measuring achievement? Okay, so I'm going to go more with that last argument. But before I do, I want to show you this little poster here. You may have seen the posters of like an eagle soaring, and it'll say things like success to motivate you. Well, there's this company called Demotivators that do the opposite. And so here we have an athlete, and it says failure when your best just isn't good enough. And this reminds me of the No Child Left Behind, because you have schools where teachers are working hard, students are working hard, administrators are working hard, kids are making amazing progress, but yet because of the way the system is set up, they're labeled as failures, and so their best just isn't good enough. And I'd rather see a system that can acknowledge the good things that are happening and not just calling everyone a failure when really it's not failure. So let's look specifically at the performance in terms of meeting those AMAOs, okay, for each state. So one thing that I found looking through the data is that there's massive variation across the state in terms of meeting these goals. Okay, so if you look at that first one, number 1, AMAO number 1, making progress in learning English. So again, this was how many students moved up from level 1 to level 2, or at least improved one level. In 2008 and 2009, there was a state that only 18.4% of the students moved up at least one proficiency level. But yet in 2010, there was a state that claimed that 97.6% of their English language learners moved up at least one proficiency level. Okay, so again, you see it really low to a really high one, where almost every ELL in the state made progress in learning English. Okay, now looking at AMAO number 2, attaining proficiency in English. So in 2008 to 2009, there was a state where only 3.4%, less than 4% of the English language learners in that state reached a level of proficiency, okay, and only up to a high of 64. Where in 2009, 2010, a low of 5.4, to look at this, almost 90%, almost every single ELL student, 9 out of 10 students in that state became proficient in English that year. I don't know about you, but I find that number highly unbelievable. Okay, but we'll leave it at that. This is what the data say. Okay, and then for AMAO number 3, remember this has to do with passing the regular math and reading tests that all the students take. Okay, so in 2008 to 2009, for the Reading English Language Arts test, there was a state where only 5.3% of the English language learners met the passing criteria for that year, to a high of a state for this year, 84.8%. And then math, it was even worse. It was a state where less than 2% of the English language learners met the growth target for math, for passing the math test, to a high of 84.9%. So again, a huge range here. You see the same range here in 2009, 2010. English language arts from 8.6 to a high of 81.9. And in math, at least we got some improvement there, right? From 1.7 to a little over 10% in one state passing the math test, to a high of 86% of the students passing the math test. Okay, so again, notice this pattern of huge variations across the state. So I thought, well, maybe we can look at those 9 states. Let me go back here. Okay, yeah. So I thought maybe we can see, well, who are the 9 states that made progress, okay, in meeting all 3 AMAOs? Because under No Child Left Behind's logic, supposedly these are the states that are doing a fantastic job with their English language learners and should be a model for the country, right? So one thing we'll notice is that it wasn't the same 9 states in both 2008 to 2009 and from 2009 to 2010. In fact, only Alabama, Texas, and Wisconsin made the list both years. And I don't know about you, and if any of you are from Alabama, my apologies, but when we think about states that are awesome with ELLs, is Alabama the first state that comes to mind? Okay. Well, we do have states like Texas, and I spent a lot of time in Texas, and I can tell you that there's a lot of districts that are not doing what they're supposed to be doing for their English language there either. And again, just kind of looking at these lists of states here, you don't really see any rhyme or reason about, well, why are these states the successful ones? Okay. So why do we see such wide variation? One thing to understand, this is important, each state varies in how they identify and reclassify English language learners. In other words, if you were in an ELL in one state and you moved to another state, it's possible that you would not be classified as an ELL in that state. Okay? And also in terms of how ELLs are reclassified, in some states, whatever the test says, then they're reclassified. In other states, such as Texas, there has to be a committee of teachers, specialists, parents who look at each student case by case. They also consider their performance on the regular English language arts exam, and then they make the decision about whether the students are reclassified or not. So that process varies across states. All right, each state creates their own standards and assessments. Okay? And so some states have made really hard tests. Some states have made very easy tests. Each state sets their own passing standards. Okay? So even if the test is easy or hard, the state can then decide, well, what percent of questions do they need to get right in order to pass it? And that can vary widely too. And of course, in terms of those AMAOs for Title I and Title III, each state sets their own. And so in one state, maybe only 30% need to pass the test in order to be determined to make AYP. But in another state, they said 60% need to pass the test to make the AMAO. So given this massive variation, that report I've been pulling the data from includes this disclaimer. These percentages should be reviewed carefully given that proficiency is defined and tested differently in each state. So really we're comparing apples and oranges when we try to look at these different states because they're all defining and creating different kinds of tools to assess the population. So we really cannot make any meaningful comparison across these states. Okay. Another thing to understand too about the English language learner population for that LEP subgroup is that states vary in terms of the minimum number of ELLs that are required for a given school or district to even have a LEP subgroup. So let me give you a couple specific examples. In some states, the requirement is that a school has to have 30 or more ELLs at a grade level before they will be required to have a LEP subgroup. In other states, a school or a district must have, a school must have 70 or more English language learners before they're required to have an LEP subgroup. So if you're in that state and you're in a school where you have 69 English language learners at a, let's say, 3rd grade, you're not required to have an LEP subgroup. So you just made those 69 ELL kids invisible. Okay. One other thing to kind of put this in light, in the state of Texas, okay, using the same kind of subgroup minimum number for the racial categories. In Texas, there was no Asian subgroup because there was no school technically, or at least the department thought there was no school that had enough Asian students to make up an Asian subgroup, so then therefore there was no Asian subgroup in the entire state of Texas. So even if you believe in No Child Left Behind, we just left all the Asian students behind technically. Okay? So you can see that there's a lot of ways to this minimum subgroup number to hide kids as needed. So going back to our point, what can we possibly conclude about the progress of English language learners in learning English and academic content? So I thought, well, maybe let's go back to those 9 states because those are the states that made it, right, that supposedly are models. So let's take a closer look at those 9 states. Okay. So here we're looking at the data for 2008 to 2009, and you can see along the top we have the different AMAOs. Okay. The first one here is related to how many students make progress in learning English each year. So we go from a low in New Jersey where about 30% of the ELLs made progress in learning English to a high in Delaware where 62.8% made progress in learning English. But what's interesting is Mississippi didn't even provide data, but yet they were somehow declared to be one of the models for the nation. How about for attaining proficiency in English? Wisconsin reported that only 4.2% of the students that year actually became proficient in English, where New Jersey reported a high of 64.3% attaining English, and yet again Mississippi didn't provide any data, yet somehow they're a model for the nation. Now for AMAO number 3, in terms of the reading test, we have a state such as Maine where only about 10% of the English language learners passed the reading test, to a high in Tennessee where 80% passed the reading test. And then over here for math, a low in Maine of 15% of the ELLs passing the math test, with a high of 77.4% passing it in Nebraska. Okay, so as we saw with all the state data, there's really a wide range of variation across these scores, and so it's not clear why these are the successful ones. Now I want to post one other state here. I want to show you New York. Okay, so here's New York, and what I want you to do is just take, I'm going to be quiet for a second, I want you to look at their scores compared to the ones that were successful. So New York was a failure. These states are the ones that are successful. So just take a look for that for a second. Do you see anything that surprises you? Okay. When I look at this, I'm like, well, let's see. 65% of their ELLs made progress in learning English, which is much higher than the lowest one, and even higher than over half of the ones on the list. In terms of attaining English proficiency, again, higher than the lowest, pretty close to the second. For the reading and math, their scores are much higher than several of the others that are on the list. So then why is it that New York is a failure? The teachers in New York are failures, their students are failures, their schools are failures, their administrators are failures, and yet a state like Mississippi that didn't even report data, or a state like Maine where you have these very low passing rates for reading and math, are somehow excelling. Okay? We see a similar pattern here for 2009, 2010. And I'll just highlight the lows and highs for AMO number 1, for AMO number 2, attaining proficiency in English, and then for the reading scores and for the math scores. And once again, we pull up New York. And you can see again here that they're much higher in AMO number 1 than several of the states listed, higher than most of the ones in number 2, and higher, comparable in their reading and math scores to all the states that made it. Okay? So again, what can we learn from those 9 states that met all 3 of their AMAOs? Well, number one, we've seen that the achievement ranges vary widely. And states in New York that actually had higher levels of achievement across the 3 AMAOs were still deemed as failing to make AYP. And so when we look at this system and we look at what does it really mean to make these annual measurable achievement objectives and making all 3 of them, yet it still provides us very little indication of how effective is a state in helping ELLs learn English. How effective is a state in helping ELLs learn academic content? How well ELLs are actually doing, and which states are doing a better job meeting the language and academic needs of English language learners. And this is pretty tragic, thinking how much time, sweat, tears, suffering that we've gone through to be able to try to comply with No Child Behind, and yet we're getting very little useful data that can really tell us much of anything about how students are doing and how they compare across different states. So one thing that I hope you drew a conclusion from is that No Child Behind isn't working very well. And right now there's very little debate about that. There's very little support for No Child Behind between either Republicans or Democrats. There's wide acknowledgments of its failures. However, it should have been reauthorized like 6 or 7 years ago. And there's only serious efforts underway now that just started in January to really reauthorize the law. I think the Republicans are waiting until they had a majority in the House and the Senate to start that work. But the Obama administration realized a few years ago that, hey, this No Child Behind is on a collision course. We're going to get to 2014. All the states are going to be labeled as failing. So if Congress isn't going to do something, we need to do something about that. So what they did is they invited states to request flexibility regarding specific requirements of No Child Behind, and they call that ESEA flexibility. In order to get this flexibility or to get the waiver, the states had to develop rigorous plans that were designed to improve outcomes for all students, close the achievement gaps, increase equity, and improve the quality of education. So among other things, the 3 main things that the states had to do to get waived for No Child Behind was they had to develop or adopt college and career readiness standards. Okay, does that sound familiar? They had to develop or adopt corresponding English language proficiency standards, and they had to develop or adopt assessments to measure those standards. Okay? So when you hear about the college and career readiness standards, it really comes and stems from this ESE flexibility, and these principles also have their roots in the Race to the Top program that the Obama administration had been running prior to this. So when states were offered to get away from No Child Behind, they jumped at it. So on this map, all the states that you see in blue have been approved for ESEA flexibility. The states in green, plus the Bureau of Indian Education, are currently seeking waivers, and they're under review. So that's 45 that have requested, 43 that have been approved, 3 that are awaiting. And I'll also point out that California, while the state as a whole has not requested a waiver, there's a group of, I believe, 10 school districts, some of the largest school districts in California, have formed a coalition called CORE, and together they received their own waiver from No Child Behind. So a massive number of English language learners are benefiting from that waiver there. Okay. So what are the concerns, though, as we move forward under the Obama administration's federal education policies? If you notice, the focus is still on high-stakes testing and accountability. Okay? So even though we've established that we really don't know how to test English language learners in a valid, reliable manner, yet that's still the core of the policy. Also, when we say that there's ESEA flexibility and waivers from No Child Behind, it's really only waivers from the Title I AYP system. So a lot of the No Child Behind requirements are still in place, including the Title III requirements that we just went over. And so states are still accountable, waiver or not, to make sure that ELLs are making progress in learning English, attaining English proficiency, and passing the regular test. Now, when those states had to create their own plans to negotiate those with the federal government in order to get that waiver, a lot of them, instead of having a separate LEP subgroup, they eliminated that and they just lumped ELLs with other students with unique needs like special ed students and students living in poverty, etc., into one large super subgroup. And so those that were in favor of No Child Behind because it made us focus directly on ELLs are now concerned because under these waiver plans, the ELLs are buried in with all these other students, and arguably their ELL students' needs are much different than some of those other students, so will those needs be addressed? Okay. A major concern is that part of these policies under the Obama administration are that there's a mandate to tie student test performance to teachers' evaluations, which could also be related to how much teachers are paid, if they get a raise or not, etc. So now the high stakes have been the highest they've ever been. And remember, we have not resolved the issue of how to test ELLs in a valid and reliable manner, which means that decisions being made about teachers' evaluations and performance and raises, etc., are being made on test scores of very questionable validity. So obviously a very big concern. Okay, so currently now, as we're moving away from No Child Behind, there's this thing called the Common Core State Standards Initiative, and I imagine several of you are in states that have this, are part of the Common Core. So officially, this is a state-led effort to develop college and career readiness standards in English, language arts, and math. In other words, the same kind that you need to get an ESE flexibility waiver from No Child Behind. So states then have a choice. They can either, if they want the flexibility waiver, adopt the Common Core, or they can develop their own college and career readiness standards. Well, surprise, surprise, most states felt it was a lot less work to just adopt the Common Core rather than try to make their own. So far, 43 states, D.C., 4 U.S. territories, and the Department of Defense schools have all adopted the Common Core state standards. And there's just a handful of what I call the rebel states, Alaska, Indiana, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, Virginia, and Puerto Rico. Indiana, where I currently am, actually was part of the Common Core state standards. They, because of the political controversy surrounding the Common Core, the legislature passed a law that says it's illegal for us to be in a consortium, and so Indiana had to withdraw from the Common Core. And then within a few months, they had to obviously come up with their own college and career readiness standards. And so I've been told that they look very much like the Common Core. We just don't call them that, and so then supposedly that makes the politicians happy. Okay, but they're definitely college and career readiness standards. Now, once we have common standards, then it's possible to have common assessments. And so there's 2 state consortia that are developing tests to measure the Common Core state standards, PARC and Smarter Balanced. And so most of the Common Core states belong to either PARC or the Smarter Balanced to share the same tests to measure those standards. Also, remember there was the requirement that the states had to revise their English language proficiency standards so that they, quote, correspond to the college and career readiness standards, or they correspond to the Common Core state standards. Now, that word correspond is interesting because nobody really knows what they mean by correspond. Nevertheless, there's been a lot of efforts to make something look like they correspond. So rather than try to figure that on their own, most states now have joined one of 2 English language proficiency development standards consortiums. The big one is WIDA, and a lot of you are probably in WIDA states, 35 states and territories so far. And then there's a smaller consortium called ELPA 21, and there's 11 states that are part of that. And so these states will have the same English proficiency standards and assessments, and a lot of those same states are either part of the PARC or the Smarter Balanced. Okay. So what are the concerns moving forward with the Common Core state standards? First off, we've seen that the states quickly adopted the Common Core state standards before they were even developed, before they were even field tested, when they were just basically an idea. All the states jumped on this bandwagon. Within the Common Core, the push is to use computer-based testing and new question types. Okay? And so that raises a few issues just in terms of psychometrics. When we have new question types where it's not just A, B, C, or D, we're very good at coming up with our statistics to measure those. But now we have test questions where students drag things around on the screen with a mouse, or they highlight portions of a text, or they draw lines of symmetry in a math problem, which is great, but yet we've never done that before, and so we don't know for sure yet how to score those types of items. Another item you've probably heard about is where there's a 2-part question for a reading comprehension item. So they'll read in a passage about a boy going shopping with his mom, and they might ask, how did he feel about shopping with his mom? And they will answer A, B, C, or D. But then the next question will ask, well, how do you know? Because they want evidence from text. And so they either have to select a portion of the text that shows how he felt or something like that. So then a big question comes up is, well, what if they get the first part right or the second part wrong? Or the second part right, but the first part wrong? And so again, that throws kind of a wrench into some of our traditional psychometric models of scoring tests. But the bigger question is, do the schools have the technology necessary to do these tests? And just to give you one example from my home state of Indiana, it was an absolute debacle. We have several rural communities with small schools in them. They don't have the best technology. They don't have the best internet access. And the state as a whole, where they have their servers, they were crashing when all the students tried to log in and take the test. So test pages would load, or they couldn't log in, or they would click their answers and then click and then nothing would happen, or it would just freeze up. And so there were several schools that basically had to pull out paper and pencil and do it paper and pencil wise. And so we're really not ready technology wise to move in this direction. Another question is if Common Core State Standards is really a state-led initiative. As you can see, the federal government created the initiative. The federal government has funded the creation of the PARCC and Smarter Balance tests. And big businesses are really, really, really happy about the Common Core State Standards because instead of having to make textbooks for 50 different states, they can now just make one set of textbooks for the Common Core, and most states are going to be able to use them, or one test, and most states will take it. So it's been great for the education companies. It continues the same failed testing and punish system of No Child Left Behind. In fact, the amount of testing potentially increased from No Child Left Behind. Notice that the Common Core State Standards does not specifically address English language learners, but it does now have language standards that apply to all students. And so the bar is being raised for all students, and so some fear that that means that ELLs could even fall further behind. I will point out that there are some ELL experts who are actually hopeful about this because they think that if we increase the focus on language and have higher expectations, then that's going to help ELLs reach those higher expectations. But again, we're going to have to see how that plays out to see if that's the case or not. Okay, all the problems with accommodations under No Child Left Behind have not been resolved, and so those carry over to the Common Core State Standards test. And of course, there's concern about the impact on mindful education programs, okay? Because states could have their tests in either Spanish or English or other languages. So are the Common Core tests through PARCC and Smarter Balance, are they going to allow testing in the native language? What kind of accommodations they're going to have? And a lot of those issues are still being worked out. I will point out, though, that California and New York both have bilingual Common Core State Standards initiatives that are trying to address those issues. So here's the bottom line for us, okay? Educators must be ever vigilant to ensure that these new reform efforts do not leave English language learners even further behind than No Child Left Behind, okay? And so I just want to mention my book real quick. Literally was just published yesterday. I got my copy of the mail yesterday. But within the book, I try to address these issues that we're talking about in terms of as we're moving to this new era of Common Core and other things, how do we still make sure that we're providing effective instruction for English language learners? And so you can see here that in addition to some chapters on language and language learning and teaching, issues of policy, there's some specific chapters looking at what kind of program models can be effective ways of doing assessment, and then specifically in terms of how do we provide effective listening, speaking, reading, and writing instruction, and content area instruction for English language learners. And even if you're in a non-bilingual classroom, what are some ways we can provide primary language support, effective instruction, and also be advocates for our ELLs. And I'll just mention, too, that the book, I don't have any control over what the publisher sets as the price, and so to be honest, I'm a little disappointed about the high price. But they do have a special discount for those of you that are participating in this webinar. That's a pretty substantial discount. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to click on the link there. But just a couple of things that I mentioned in the book addressing these issues. First off, we must ensure that the unique cultural, linguistic, and academic needs of ELLs are addressed. And so part of that is ensuring that we have daily ESL or English Language Development instruction for ELLs at all levels, not just levels 1s, 2, or 3s. Okay? All students at all levels of English proficiency need that daily instruction. We need to make sure that the instructional activities with complex text, okay, that's a big push under Common Core State Standards, is we have to have kids reading complex text like the Gettysburg Address, okay? But as we do that, we still have to take into account the proficiency level of English language learners. So if we're going to use that, we have to scaffold like crazy. And I just want to note that there's a wonderful resource out there that's been put together by the Understanding Language Initiative. This is a group led by Kinji Hakuda out of Stanford, and they have sample units on their webpage for English language arts that shows exactly how we can provide that kind of scaffolding with English language learners working with these complex texts. Okay? And I want to emphasize, though, that even as we're using these complex texts, that must not replace literacy instruction that is tailored to the ELL's English proficiency and reading levels. So we still have to do guided reading, shared reading, read-alouds, where the texts are closely matched to their proficiency levels. Otherwise, it's going to be way over their head, and they won't be able to learn from it. Okay? We have some nice tools. If you're in a WIDA state, you're familiar with the WIDA standards, the can-do descriptors, and the model performance indicators, and those are very helpful in differentiating instruction. If you're not in a WIDA state, these are very similar to the TESOL standards, and your own state probably also has very specific ELP standards that can help you differentiate that instruction for your ELLs. And then finally, there's a critical need for multiple measures of students' progress through the use of ongoing, authentic formative assessments. We cannot rely on PARCC and Smarter Balance to tell us how well our kids are doing. We need to be using assessment throughout the school year, very meaningful, authentic assessments, and using that to help drive the instruction for English language learners. Okay, and I'm going to end there. Thank you very much, and I'll turn the time back over to Sarah and the folks at Cal. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Wayne. And we invite our participants to submit questions via the chat box in GoToWebinar. And we have a couple that have already come in, and so we'll just mention these to you, Wayne, and we'd love to hear what are your thoughts. An earlier question was, isn't WIDA access testing, I think we mean the test there, a way to make testing of English language proficiency more consistent?
You did.
Great. Thank you for asking that question. So one thing you noticed under the when we were looking at the AMAOs, where you had 50 states with 50 different tests, et cetera, one of the exciting developments is the formation of these consortiums. And so at least for those 35 states within the WIDA, there will be a much better possibility of comparing states as they're all technically using the same standards and technically using the same assessment, the assets too. I do understand, though, that states maintain some control in terms of setting the passing standards for their WIDA test. So WIDA does not dictate what the passing standards are. And that has to do a lot with issues of state control versus, federal control, et cetera. So as we do look at those states across the WIDA standards, we do need to take a look in terms of what are the individual passing standards in each of those states. But I agree that this is progress in the right direction for that. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's really valuable to think about. So here's an interesting one. Would you mind sharing your views on opt-out and refusal of state exams by parents? We had record numbers this past year where this person is wondering how and what this will change.
Unmuted.
Fantastic question. I was just in Western New York last week at SUNY Fredonia, which is near Seneca, New York, and Seneca had a 70% opt-out rate from the Common Core State Standards test. And several of the teachers in my audience were part of districts where there were high opt-out rates. So let me just say in general that, number one, I think it's fantastic that parents are able to exert their right and decide whether or not they want their students to participate in these things. I think it's going to send a strong message to policymakers that this is kind of getting out of hand. And I think part of my presentation was emphasizing that. Another example, just here locally in Indiana, in the political mess in terms of moving away from Common Core, having to develop our own standards and assessments overnight, it turned out that our students in elementary school and other grades were going to be subjected to about 13 hours of testing. And of course, when parents heard that, they reeled. Policymakers weren't happy about that. They had to bring in a couple of testing experts who work that should normally take a year, they did in a weekend, and they basically just slashed a bunch of questions and portions of tests to try to get it down to about 8 or 9 hours, which is still a lot. But really, it just kind of shows that parents are kind of putting their foot down and saying, you know, enough is enough, and we need to have some more common sense brought back into our schools. And so I'm happy to see that. To be honest, I'm a little concerned, though. We kind of see two different political camps that are coming against the Common Core state standards. There's an argument from the right in terms of state rights and looking at Common Core. They call it Obama Core, even though it really was a state initiative. But they see that as, you know, kind of a move towards a national curriculum, a national test, and they believe that takes away states' rights. And so there's a lot of talk on, you know, Fox News and conservative radio programs bashing the Common Core, and a lot of parents are getting their information from that and making their decisions based on that. And then those, you know, more on the left are concerned about a lot of the issues that we've talked about, just in terms of, you know, how accurate are these tests, is this really the best use of our time, et cetera. So I think it's a good thing that there's pressure from both sides. I think it's a bad thing that everyone's opposing it for different reasons. And I think in order for us to be able to move forward with something more sensible, is we need to talk to each other. We need to identify, you know, what are the positive aspects, what are the negative aspects, what are some ways this can be fixed. But one thing that I would personally hope to see is that there's less testing, there's less emphasis on testing, and that we recognize that these kind of standardized tests are just one small part of many things that we should be looking at in terms of how to support instruction for not only English language learners but all students. And so again, my hope is that the opt-out movement will kind of force some soul searching, and it's coming at an opportune time because, again, this is when people are actually starting to look at No Child Left Behind and how to reauthorize it. So I'm hopeful that something positive will come out of it. I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we have a question that has to do. We have, I think, two that are a nice sort of segue. Do you consider ESL / ELD, English Language Development Instruction, to be separate from the tailored literacy instruction for English language learners? Is this a separate time of the day, or is this infused throughout the day with scaffolding? Thoughts on that?
Unmuted.
Excellent question, and thank you for asking that. My view is that it's definitely separate, okay? And let me give you a couple reasons why. Number one, schools and districts have English language arts standards. They have English language arts assessments, okay? Just like they have math standards, math assessments, science standards, science assessments, etc. We also have ESL standards, and we have ESL assessments. There are specific goals that we have to meet through Title III in terms of making progress in learning English, attaining English proficiency, that are separate from the same standards that all the other students have to meet in terms of passing English language arts. What the ESL teacher does is more in lines of what a foreign language teacher does. They're teaching English, they're teaching a language to students for whom that language is new. When you have a language arts teacher, or even at the high school, secondary level, when you have an English, you know, regular English teacher, they're not teaching a language that's new to the students. They're helping those students with refined skills and specific topics within that content area. So in other words, language arts in your high school English, those are content areas, not necessarily a language. And all students are learning new skills within that, such as different genres, literary elements, and things like that. And so I do get concerned when I see this idea that we can somehow make English language arts and ESL the same thing, because they're not. There's very different things. Now, that said, we absolutely have to provide sheltered content area instruction. And so English language arts must be sheltered for English language learners, just like math, science, social studies must be sheltered for English language learners. But yet, that sheltering does not replace the teaching of direct systematic ESL or English language development instruction. One thing that I notice when I look at the data across states is you see English language learners making progress, moving from level 1 to level 2 to level 3, but then they get stuck at level 4, level 5 for several years. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we typically will provide pull out ESL or pull in ESL, or we'll put them in a classroom with a teacher who's certified and provides their own ESL instruction in addition to language arts and others. But once they get to a certain level, we think like, oh, they can learn the rest of English now through their English language arts instruction, through their sheltered math instruction, etc. And we see that that's not necessarily happening. And that's why I make that argument that they do need that specific instruction. And the reviews of research that have been done by CREED and by the National Language Panel also found that there's strong support for the need to keep that separate but also complementing each other. Okay. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. And we have, if we can squeeze in two more, I think this is a nice sort of transition from some of the broader discussion, and maybe we'll sort of get a little bit bigger picture after we talk about this one. Can you give some examples of meaningful, ongoing, formative assessment for English language learners?
Unmuted.
Yes, thank you. One thing I'm a big fan of, and I actually have several examples of this in the book. So, for example, in terms of oral language development, there's a nice tool that was developed by bilingual teachers in California back in the 70s and 80s. It's kind of gone nationwide, called the SOLEM, the Student Oral Language Observation Matrix. And so just whenever students did an oral presentation or were engaged in a conversation or retelling a story, the teachers could break that out, and it would help them focus both in terms of the students' comprehension, how much do they understand when spoken to, but also in things like their pronunciation, their grammar, their fluency, their rate of speech, those kinds of things. One thing I found that a lot of times when we focus on our English language learners is we tend to only focus on the accent or on the grammar mistakes. And I found that using this kind of form of assessment can help teachers focus on the wide range of skills that are present within their oral language. And then that can then be used by them to consider what are the students' strengths, what are the areas in need of improvement, and then what kinds of activities can I provide to help them make those kinds of improvements. Within the second edition of the textbook, I actually have a revised version of the SOLEM. I call it the SOLEM R that I revised and that I use to bring kind of up to date with what we know about second language acquisition and teaching in the classroom. So that's a nice tool. In terms of English language arts, I'm a big fan of running records. When I was a classroom teacher, I was doing running records with my students every day. And running records are things that you would normally do with native English speakers. But with when I work with my students that I train here and that I've done at other universities, is when we do a running record, we look at some of the errors and we analyze those errors specific to the student's level of English proficiency. And so we might look in terms of, well, what might be an error because of some cross interaction from their first language? What might be a reason why the student couldn't read this word? Is it a decoding error, or is it because they don't even know the meaning of this word, therefore through the decoding skills they still weren't able to determine what it was? And so by taking that kind of second language learning lens onto that running record analysis, it really provides a lot of really good information, not only about their language, not only about their literacy development, but about their language development. And therefore, the next day after doing a running record like that, I might have a mini lesson where I noticed a student was struggling with compound words, or I noticed a student didn't know a certain vocabulary word, and so I'm going to make sure that that's part of the lesson. Or that when I teach an ESL lesson, I'm going to make that the focus of the ESL lesson. So that would be another one. And of course, the writing evaluations that we do with a rubric, I think, are critical. And again, not only doing it the same way we do with all students, but looking specifically in terms of what might be some language learning specific issues within their writing, and then addressing those through many lessons. And I argue that collecting that kind of data throughout the year not only helps you drive instruction, but at the end of the year, when you look at those evaluations and assessments from the beginning of the year, the middle of the year, and the end of the year, you have this amazing demonstration of how much growth your students have made over the year. And whether or not they pass the state test, the students know, and you can show the parents and your administrators that, wow, this kid made a lot of progress. So I hope that gives you a few examples of what you're looking for.
Great. Yeah, those are very valuable sort of tangible real-world examples. And then, as I mentioned, sort of, let's take a step back with this one. What would be your recommendations for education policy priorities going forward in the last minute or so that we have? We would love to hear that from you, Wayne. Thanks so much.
Unmuted.
Well, all that in a minute. Okay. Well, I'll just say again that I think that as we're working on the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, there needs to be a de-emphasis on high-stakes testing, meaning we need to remove the high stakes that are associated with them. I think there needs to be less testing, and I think there needs to be an emphasis on multiple measures, including all those types of alternative authentic assessments we talked about at the classroom level. What I've seen, I think, is the number one problem is that because the tests are so high stakes, so much instruction gets focused on that we're losing sight of what the English language learners really need, such as providing ELD instruction or providing instruction that is tailored to their specific, proficiency levels through our sheltered instruction. And my hope is that if the tests are de-emphasized, the stakes are removed, there's less of it, that we can provide more and more of the type of instruction that English language learners need to be successful. And I'll leave it at that. It's 1 o'clock.
Great. Thank you so much. And we will remind all of our participants of the opportunity to win $100 through our monthly lesson planning opportunity and competition opportunity, I should say. Thank you for participating so much, everyone. We do very much appreciate your participation here as well as in the larger Education Connections community. Dr. Wright, it's been wonderful to hear your expertise and thoughts, and we very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Signing off then. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.